Welcome to the Relational Matters Archive conversation number 5 with Yolande, Zola, Zoli von der Heide. It's a great pleasure to be here. My name is Katrin Thiele. I'm the initiator of this project, and otherwise I'm teaching and researching in the Graduate Gender Program at Utrecht University. I would also like to introduce Ida Hillerop-Hansen, a PhD student at Utrecht University and the co-organizer of the Relational Matters Archive. Ida oversees the technical details of these sessions and usually also moderates the online sessions chat, as we are today live and on location, very nicely in the Van Abbe Museum. Ida's involvement is also a little bit more in person, but Ida, I would like to give you the word at the beginning here to still explain how the format of these conversations take shape.
Yes. So the Relational Matters Archives has been running a series of conversations throughout the spring and summer of 2022. The conversations are recorded and they will be available online in the archive on the webpage, where you can also go and learn about the project. So each conversation in the archive is structured around 3 questions. It will last around 45 minutes, and then we will take time for Q&A about 10 to 15 minutes. So do share your thoughts and questions then. And then I want to say thank you to the museum and for Yolande for hosting us.
Very welcome.
For the very first time in person, and to Ron for all the technical support. I need that. And then I will give the floor to Yolande and Katrin.
Yes, I would like to also once more second thanks to the museum, to Yolande for being here, to the technical help and support by Ron. Before we start the conversation, I would like to rehearse first a little bit in few words what the aim of the Relational Matters Archive is, the work that it hopes to do, and also then introduce once more today's interlocutor. The Relational Matters Archive aims to collect insights and divergent practices dealing with relationality as a starting point for research inquiries and ways of living. The archive is part of a project in which 2 claims are interwoven in the attempt to engage with and attune ourselves to today's planetary condition. On the one hand, an engagement with relational matters, which expresses an insistence on the interactive and messily entangled condition of current times. And on the other hand, the statement that relation matters, meant as a more ethical and political wager to become more literate and more carefully attuned to what entanglement as living condition implies. That is, what does such a claim ask from us when living it? It's important for me to emphasize that to take a relational point of departure does not propose relationality as a solution in itself. Rather, this conversation that we are having around relational matters want to inquire what relationality means in specific contexts and on different scales, and how a relational approach could offer maybe significant insights to what is happening around, amongst, and within us. I look so much forward to having today the chance to listen to and converse with Yolande, Zola, Zoli von der Heide on these matters. Yolande is exhibitions curator at the Van Abbe Museum since 2020. She's the curator of A Lasting Truth of Change, an exhibition we just before this conversation had the privilege to collectively experience with her guidance. The exhibition is still ongoing at the Van Abbe Museum until the end of July 2022, and it will provide also the background to our conversation on relational matters. 23?
No, 22, you're right. You're right. Sorry.
Don't worry. As Yolande wrote in her short bio for our archive, her interest, and I find this important to read, lie in joyous and equitable ways of being together, as well as intersecting modes that decenter the oppressor in practices of freedom and liberation, and to influence art institutional practices with this. I had the privilege to get to know Yolande's understanding of her work as a collective intervention already, while she has worked at the Utrecht-based non-profit Casco Art Institute, working for the Commons, before she came to Van Abbe Museum, and having had now the possibility to also walk with Yolande through the exhibition A Lasting Truth of Change is Change, not A Lasting Truth is Change, which explicitly asked us to relate anew and maybe differently to and with the museum's art collection, and the museum also as a conservational institution, makes me extremely excited to have her in the Relational Matters archive as a contributor. Before I close with these introductory words, let me quickly also mention that there is an accompanying book publication available to A Lasting Truth is Change, entitled also A Lasting Truth is Change, which Yolande co-edited with her colleague Tyler Lemel. And another co-edited book, also related to Yolande's work at Van Abbe, has also just appeared this year. It's co-edited with her colleague Nick Eikins, and it's entitled I Think My Body Feels, I Feel My Body Thinks, on corporal literacy. The last one is also an open access publication, so I can highly recommend finding that book online. But now, without further delay, let's start our conversation with the first questions, the first of the three that we want to discuss for this archive. So, Yolande.
Wow.
Now we come to the discussion part. How does relationality actually figure in your work and practice? How would you say are you engaged with in relationality? Or from which angle you would say you engage with that question of relationality or relational matters?
I mean, it's a really compounded question, and I think when I first read it or heard you and Ida speak about it, it became clear to me that actually we need to be in relation to the site of the exhibition. So if I'm practicing, and so the time that you extended your kind invitation, thanks to Katrin and Ida for the invitation, I thought, yeah, it needs a specificity. So if room 10, for example, is dealing with this question of change in relation to site or place-based practice, it's an invitation also to be in relation with your direct environment, right? And I mean, it was also interesting to me that relational matters is coming out of a time where we're forced to be apart, the time of social distancing, right? So actually this question of relation comes into play. Again, how do we relate when we have to keep social distance, or how do we relate to our neighbors, for example? So I think this question of proximity, of how we relate to those that are most proximate to us, was a bit in the air or in the zeitgeist. And like I was saying before, that's certainly the case for case with working with a collection, right? The collection is a neighbor in a way, or at best I think collections also operate as a neighbor. It's a municipal museum, which means we're in a civic space, which means it belongs, if at all, as much to me as it does to you. So it's a neighbor. And then the question then becomes is how we actually accommodate those around so that they can feel it as such, right? I'm not sure if I'm like addressing your question, but
Very much so.
so there's many layers to it, maybe. So relationality came into play with working with the collection display, but then maybe one more traditional way of working with a collection is to try and tell a story of modern art history. And I was joking a lot of times with the colleagues from the collection that I'm trespassing in the collection. It wasn't an am in a sense, like I said before, it wasn't a task that I usually would have taken up, but I'm very, very happy I did, because actually when you reflect on collection, you're reflecting also on history, which makes the path, the future path, clear. Like it makes the work ahead really clear when you understand quite concretely what it means to have a collection of works that are around 3,200 works and only 130 members of that collection are women identifying artists. And also, I mean, not to begin with like the limitations of classification and binary systems that we still have to work with. What then do you do? So traditionally, maybe you would still try to tell a story of modern art in a linear way and represent certain figures, but I was more interested in bringing works and learning from them too around this question of change and how change can figure in a heritage institution.
And if I may, I would like to precisely get you to that question of change, because as you said also to us at the beginning, the exhibition is very inspired by your reading of the parables by Octavia Butler, and of course her very important The Earth Seed lesson. All that you touch, you change. All that you change changes you. The only lasting truth is change.
God is
change. It's added there. But I would love to, maybe in line with what you already said, when you think about, you know, how you related to the task of this exhibition, how you also related to yourself in this Infonappe to you know, to also do that exhibition, and then you were very connected to that question of change in the same sense also of how would you say the issues that you talked about, the relational or the you know, this relational here, how is it really connected to that also, that it is about change? And I find this very interesting for me, that I find the change is, when you also go through the exhibition, the way you do, you produce change, but in somewhat a matter of not just changing the objects that are displayed, or not changing the collection, or change. You know, not doing change as something, you replace something, but you are, the exhibition shows to me this relation that you have described, but then the point is about change. So I would love to hear still a little bit more about change, if you can do that.
I mean, maybe something that's important to say, maybe where I should always begin, or I'm reminded time and time again, is that the exhibition is propositional, which is to say that exhibition spaces are where maybe experiment, at least as I understand it, and proposition can happen, which is not to be mistaken with structural change, right? So actually how the institution structured, that's the proposition for that, or the tools sometimes, or methodologies. I think what I tried to speak through a little bit when I'm highlighting, I don't know, Fiasugapes and the Black Monks and their methodology, or Simikyo Plumo's methodology. But it's propositional. How it's taken up is different in the infrastructure, right, of an institution. And both of you are institutional beings as well, so you understand that. But I think maybe it's important to highlight that the work is different and arduous on the back end of an institution, right, as opposed to the front. And I think particularly with institutions like a museum, those that deal with exhibition, actually it's a slippery slope, because you can obscure the true work that should happen in the back end through presentation on the front, through representation on the front, right? So concretely, I could obscure that there's only the ratio of 130 women identifying artists, and out of the 3,200, give or take. One way of doing that would just be to focus on them, or to center them somehow. Right, but it doesn't change actually the realities of that in the back end. So maybe that's one, to say that they're two different, I would say, interdependent practices. So for me, I need the exhibition space, the propositions that are brought about through artwork, because the space is speculation. So I don't think it's coincidence that I revert back to science fiction, which is precisely the field of speculation and future casting as a kind of skeletal backbone of the exhibition. So that kind of future casting that Octavia Butler does is maybe similar, or I see in relation to also how certain works also operate together in the exhibition. And then, more tricky and sticky is the back end, right? And how change happens there. And I mean, I started thinking about these questions in 2020, so you will remember also what the kind of political zeitgeist was then too. I think we were all asking our institutions to live up to the world that we want to see for more just and joyous ways of being together. It's not necessarily a kind of unique question, or one that recurs and remains. But in the back end, to address change with collection, one concrete site would be acquisition.
Mm-hmm.
So principles of acquisition. So I'm not so much interested in works being included, or the question of inclusion and representation. I think that's really a trap, actually. You can do that through exhibition, but it's the conditions under which those works are included. And that's actually where the work begins, because if you host them, it requires you as the host to also change, not that you remain the same when you're inviting in a work by artists that have been previously structurally left out.
That's wonderful. That's very important, exactly. That I'm very happy that you're saying this about the condition. I find it's an extremely important point, and that leads maybe to our second dimension already, namely what I, from maybe, it sounds a little more research-oriented, but I mean it really as a praxeological or praxis, what methodological shifts can occur when you see emerging when you approach your work from a relational point of view, both in your curatorial but maybe also in your activist or daily life. What shifts occur more like, as I now already put here, on a more methodological or a little bit of a smaller level. What happens there, so to speak? That's the interest of that question. What happens where? What happens when you more the how-to now? The how-to dimension of if you say that you are also engaged in doing your work from a relational point of view in all the dimensions you explained to us. What shifts are inherent to that practice, or can emerge also from that practice, or could be proposed in this?
I love how the questions escalate. I think maybe one way of answering it, and it's a bit on my mind, is actually if we're relating to one another or collaboration with artists, that way of, so one way of maybe putting together an exhibition is to come up with a thematic and then approach artists that fit neatly into that thematic. That's one way. Another way that, I don't know if I chose it or it just, it's how I'm trained through Casco, is to try and relate or speak to or find what is urgent both for the artists that you are inviting into conversation and kind of insofar meet halfway. And that's a different way of working in that you're not predetermining the end results if the end is the exhibition. Actually, you're shaping it together. So that's a shift. It's a shift. I don't know if it's a shift, but it's a difference, I would say. It's like in that I'm becoming more aware of, like in the curatorial team. Like I think we have different working methods, and I've become more aware of that one.
And also now, I think for me it sounds like you at least want to shift, because I come from this question of, we go back what you just said about the trap of representation and inclusion. So when you now say meeting halfway, I think there is exactly that is what's happening. And can you? I would love to hear more. Let's say it this way about this. How you with your approach trying to avoid exactly that trap of representation and inclusion without giving up, of course, on the recognition of the problem. That as you say, also with the numbers, that of course it is a problem of inclusivity and also of representation in some way. But to avoid that issue.
So I think the works of Stanley Brown. So the room installation that we encountered, it's in the third room of the exhibition. It's called Amount of Steps Towards Different Stata or Cities or Metropoles. So the one where you are invited to also jump over. So Stanley Brown, like we were discussing before, famously doesn't allow any images to be taken of his body, of himself, but also we as an institution can't reproduce and publish any photos of his works, which is quite, if you think of like where we are, it's a tall order actually. You cannot control it as much anymore. The age of social media and so on and so forth. And it's like learning from colleagues, it's still one of the few works in the collection that demand this amount of attention. It has this particular kind of limitation, but I think also possibility, because what it does is that it requires you, me, to be in direct relation, in direct contact engagement with the artwork, and not to, less so to engage with it through an image or reproduction of it. No, he's asking you actually to walk the Stanley meter. And I think that as a tactic, methodology, is interesting, but I also understand it as a tactic of how to exist in a collection when you understand, which I think he was conscious of, that you're one of the few like artists of color, for example, right? That, and you want to avoid, or at least I would want to avoid, and try also to avoid in as much as possible, to talk about artworks sheerly on the basis of identity. So I try not to speak, at least, sometimes I fail, about this project or the exhibition in terms of like gender or racial difference, because what happens then is that that's the trope, the thing that gets recycled and spoken about. And I find that it takes away actually from concentrating, learning from, engaging with the artwork itself, right? I also learned, for example, that it's not by coincidence that I would see, or we would see Martha Rossler next to Joan Jonas, next to Rebecca Horn, thinking about women artists that are engaging with cinema all around the same age, because they bulk together and they sold, in a sense, to us in that way. So, and then you get the women's room, right? And then that's how art history is taught. So it's never coincidence that you see those. And actually a lot of those film works I learned too came or entered the collection in a similar type of fashion altogether, which can be great too. I think maybe I haven't fully worked this out, but maybe there's a way of kind of using that you enter in communion to circumvent something. But what it does do is that it takes away from individual attention, which is not to argue for only individuated or like autonomous practice, but every year there's a Joseph Beuys retrospective. And it's nothing against Beuys, I can enjoy him too, absolutely. But it's less so for other works. So in room 1, for example, Lily von der Stocker is interesting because I think she's very conscious of this trope and she's laughing at it too. The same as Joe Bear, who's hanging on the 169 and playing with this kind of modernist, minimalist, conceptualist trope. So I think there are tools, hints in the collection through artworks. And then maybe another work that has been really important to me is that of Ima Basio-Kon, the kombucha mothers that are resting. In that, like we were talking about the title card, that includes how the kombucha mothers should be replenished. So there's a cycle to two terms that you pointed out, Sven, was maybe too far apart. We can ask her about that. That's part one. But what she's also argued for is remuneration. So teaching Sindiku and Klung in this case to be in charge of replenishing the kombucha maibas the second time. So there's a conversation happening between the two of them. And then bringing in artist pension as part of that agreement. So it's fee, but there's, I think it's 17% that goes on top of it to speak to pension. So in order for this work to be realized, she's arguing for particular conditions that I have to adhere to. So it's no longer me in this case being the person assigned to at least selecting works. It's not just that this enters, but there's a back and forth between she and I under which terms. So a person who speaks to like the conditions of being included much more like eloquently is Karen Salt in the publications, that it's, you know, the act of being included is not enough. And it's not a stand-in actually for the work that should happen on the backside of the institution.
Very nice answer. I mean, there's a lot in it, but I like very much that you come back again to the conditions, because one thing that I wanted to also just bring in just comes to me back from the readings that we had, that at some point you speak in this very also conversational book, which I thought was very nicely for us to read in beforehand, that with I would say with a methodology or with an approach that you're taking to address all these complex situations that engaging with an art collection in an institution of modern art museum, etc., what we already talked about now, what I think the exhibition does, and also how you, as a collective or as more than one person, speak about, is what you called, I think, in the book, recasting, revisioning, and I like that as something where I would see. There I see very much both the propositional dimension of this exhibition, but also recasting really as something that has to be done. And what you now spoke about in this specific artwork, I feel like that it manages to not only show this processual, but also bring in exactly certain contractual and conditional matters. I find extremely well put for this, I would say for this question about, how complex these relational matters are. It's not only about the art piece or the artwork itself. It's also not only about how it is represented or presented.
Yeah.
But it is also, and that I think the exhibition shows very much, is also really engaging within the art and the artist's intentions or goals.
Yeah.
And all of that, I think, is for this archive very important to see as a relational matter, because it's more a lens, not an issue on relationality only.
Yeah, I have to come to terms with method. So if you're not telling a linear story with items that are we're accustomed to be placed in a linear way, but building new relations with them. So how, I think, how to say this? So if you visit the collection displayed at Dwarsverbanden, you will notice, and maybe a lot of collection displays, that it's, this one particularly is architecturally heavy, which I really, really appreciate and enjoy. So it helps to move you through the works in different ways. And I think part of that is actually solution to, there's a lot of two-dimensional work. So actually ways of collecting, a problem that museums often face is space. It's maybe taboo to say in public, but actually how much space a work takes is a real issue. Like we just accumulate, we collect in this accumulative way, which is not sustainable. But nevertheless, so that's why video work, this bulk buying of women, I think became a trend too. Or you'll notice that there was a point where Guerrilla Girls, there was poster of those. The paper ephemera, there's a whole bunch that was acquired in one go too. Two-dimensional work. All great, but there's a tendency, I think particularly where women identifying arts are concerned, to acquire two-dimensional works. And there's also a way that it's polite and storable. And so in order to display or show that, you need a support structure in architecture. To do that at least in new or refreshing ways. I mean, there's only so many ways that you can hang something against walls, what I'm trying to say. Yeah.
But maybe that is also, again, very nicely transitioning to indeed the question of where do you see limitations or also dangers when in, you know, when relationality is brought in about maybe thinking in terms of planetariness or you know, a less oppositional or individualistic, or in our terms less genius oriented manner. But where would you also see maybe critiques or would give out warnings or see something that you find limiting by approaching your work, but also art, or also the propositions that you want to make with it by a relational approach?
I'm not sure I answered the previous one, but I'll move to this one.
It's not about answering, it's really about...
No, I wanted to highlight this like issue of recasting.
Yeah.
Recasting one's relation to, I think, the story of art that we know, which I had to understand. I mean, I know historical revisionism it's not that effort. It's more, I think I understand recasting in terms of, in this sense, putting works in conversation with and decentering others. Okay.
Very nice.
I feel more satisfied.
Good, perfect.
Dangers. I don't know if I would warn, but one of the things that I'm reminded of,
or and you have also maybe experienced as, you know, as problematic in the sense of that you felt. But please, I don't want to interrupt you. Go.
One thing that comes to mind is when you are reflecting on even like this question that changes site-specific or place-based, but the importance then of also focusing on local, but also translocal, which is to say that, yes, the invitation there, I suppose, is to think about change directly from the position of like the ground that's underneath your feet, but I think a subsect of that, or a step after that, is also honoring that ground is connected to wider ecosystems.
Mm-hmm.
And I think this is on my mind too, because collections are interesting. Everyone feels, those at least that visit museums often feel particularly attached to them, but also particularly attached to how they told or how they presented, which has been really fascinating to me. So when I deviate, or when the exhibition deviates to that, some can really enjoy it, and then others feel as if I'm taking something away from them. Mm-hmm. And maybe one answer to that is, it's not so much that I'm trying to take away from, but I'm trying to point to the normative ways that works are displayed. To say too that these normative modernist ways of display, when they don't serve us, we can change them. So when the 160 line doesn't serve us, we can shift it. It's an agreement in the room. And I think I see that the danger is in being kind of overly concerned with one location, or being narrow, the scope being narrow, and not connecting to wider ecosystem ways of being. I mean, like, or not. Octavia Butler has this like quote about interdependency, like something to the effect of like everything that isn't harmful, I'm paraphrasing, should be partnered. And I've been thinking a lot about that in terms of interdependency. So this challenge to partner life
Yes.
Does that address?
Absolutely. But it also addresses, I think, one other thing that I heard throughout the conversation from you now also, and just which I very much like. I read you there, so to speak. I might not what you have said, but what I read from there, that what I thought is very fascinating, how you describe on the one hand this, for you, the contextualization, everything's positioned somewhere and in conversation with something, but at the same time the wish actually to intensify actually also the attention to the individual artwork. And so in relation to the last question, so to speak, a danger I would think that you would also see is indeed that one would forget, while you very much placing in this exhibition artworks in relation to each other, that would be a misrepresentation, maybe just would take away that from the exhibition, or that would maybe not satisfy you as someone who engaged with that, so that you feel like that the relational dissolves the attention to the specific or something.
Yeah.
That I felt also by walking through that we didn't do that. That we didn't, that we really felt that we did it. So
right.
Maybe something about that. So.
Thank you. I think because works are put in conversation or relation to one another, at times I have received the feedback that takes away from individual or autonomous practice of an artist. So I think the time for autonomy for autonomous sake, it's a position I hold, is gone. But my intention with the exhibition is not to take away from, for example, Yves Klein and his invitation for us to meditate on this Yves Klein blue, but to put that proposition in conversation with others. Which is actually trying to go, as the work invites us to go deeper into the blue, but also understand that the blue is part of a wider environment, and that work is next to a window, is lowered, so that element of transcendence that I think that's also at stake in the work comes across when you're lying down next to the Ganske or the Josmonders on the other side of the wall. And I think, going back to maybe the question also of relational matters, that our planetary relation is at stake. So actually in the exhibition it became really important to open the windows and make an outside clear as much as possible, because these propositions that are happening in the exhibition space don't happen in a silo. They're connected to wider ecosystems, wider environments. So art is situated in that way too.
And that's exactly, not to show that would be exactly, not to make this awareness, would be exactly, again, maybe reintroducing a certain, cubeness of, the art cube in which we emerge. It was really nice to see the window as something that one normally doesn't see so much, and thereby the outside comes in very much. Any other thing you still think about limitations ordering? Otherwise we are close to our time anyway to round off, but I don't want to stop it yet. If there's anything that you feel like relationality also rubs with you in certain ways that you feel in this setting is still important to say.
I think maybe it goes without saying, but it's important to mention that these exhibitions too are made in relation with a team of people and a team of experts, and relies a lot actually on embodied knowledge. So stories from colleagues that are now retired telling the stories of Stanley Brown when he entered the museum, to installation team, someone remembering that this work was installed this way 15 years ago, and it has a wobbly leg on the back, so you should walk. I mean, that becomes really important to my colleague Teo, who's made the technical drawings for the exhibition, and he's been here for, he's near retirement now. So he knows the works quite intimately, having rendered them in 3D. So shout out. It's definitely not possible without a collection team who does the research and also vets whether works can be shown particular ways, because it's not to dishonor artists' intention, but to bring them into conversation. That means that we check, of course, every time something unconventional way of hanging is put forward, if it's viable, if it works with their intention. And then also different encounters from audiences. I think I'm interested in the exhibition as a site to hang out, so I tried a lot of times to domesticate the works. And I can try to create those situations, but it's up to audience as well to give feedback whether that's successful or not. And they do.
Great.
They do, yeah.
Wonderful. I think we should, we have reached our limit to our speaking time. I think I would like to give a little bit of time maybe to some one or two questions that we can still take in the time that we are having. So if someone of you would like to speak, Ida or others here, then please let's try to have this also in this format. Anybody wants to comment something or have a question?
I think maybe while if people are thinking, I will.
Perfect.
I was just thinking about what you said in the end now about the youth time, and or as an example, but also shifting around how we relate to things and the objection that you might experience from people in the institution, but also from people that encounter works, that you take something from it, that you might take something from their engagement with it. But I was also thinking the assumption that conventional ways or the ways we know of relating even allow us to relate to whatever it is that we encounter. I thought that was a kind of impact, that was very impactful when I exactly saw that blue next to the window. So that question came up for me. But I was thinking also, so powerful, you said in the beginning, working with what you have at hand, because then it becomes all about relationality, right? It's not about shifting or moving in new things, but it's about how do I relate?
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
And so I was just thinking about, because you mentioned it too, what does that look like when you go into a collection? I just don't know that, and maybe connecting that to the conversation you have in the book companion about also subjectivity in acquisition policy. Because I learned so much reading that.
So what's your question?
So my question is about what does that relating, that sort of extended process or exercise of that you do through this exhibition kind of practice, what does that look like when you go into the collection and look at what is at hand?
Right.
For you specifically, maybe for others too,
I think you I think you are quickly confronted by actually your subjectivity, which is what I was trying to argue with my colleagues through the acquisitions meeting. And they can speak for themselves. But which seems really rudimentary and basic, but how much of your subjectivity is at stake? I've been thinking about that question a lot in the museum, because it's a site for collecting and record, and is often presented as this neutral site, which is absolutely not. I mean, we know these things, right? So maybe one way I'm understanding your question is the exhibition also makes clear actually what to do in acquisition. So it's not, for me at least, so much about only focusing on women identifying artists or that type of identity, but actually women identifying artists, non-binary people that are also working in a sculptural way, that are taking up space, becomes an added condition for me to argue for the acquisition, to push up against a little bit this neat and tidy way of acquisition, right? So that kind of work in the back end of the institution is different to what is happening in the exhibition site, which is propositional, but they inform one another.
Yes. Yeah, that was a real lesson in reading that actually. Exactly that. What you also said. What it means to sort of work in that incomplete house is to go into the back room.
Yeah, and to understand the back room
exactly.
more. So that's what the collection and working with it has allowed me to do insofar that's possible. I'm not saying that I understand or what 3002 mean. That's a different life project, but it makes that path clear, that path of temporary exhibitions clear, especially if you understand the relation between temporary exhibitions is how works often enter the collection. So we spend time with it and understand at least their social life before they enter. So that relation is often. But then, how do you program your temporary exhibitions? I think that's clearer for everyone.
Yeah.
Okay. Please, yes. And will you just give
Okay. I've been very interested in the way you approach artworks and especially taking them seriously in conversation and yeah, the sort of carefulness, but also, yeah, my question is really from understanding curation as care or caring for, how would you say you approach this relation between change and care? Because you said at the beginning a little bit that often this caring for artworks is understood as very static, preserving a sort of perfect object as if objects don't change, can't change, mustn't change. So yeah, I'm very interested to hear your thoughts on change and care, how that comes together.
Change and care maybe come together through hosting. The exhibition site or museum, and if you take the space of like that we're civil servants quite literally, so we are in service too. That means that we're in the business of hosting. And hosting is also active work, is taxing work, which is to say there's a lot of responsibility for the host if I am in the position of host as curator, in that it also requires me to change. So if we're thinking about, a dinner party, I need to host and serve you foods that I might not be versed in cooking, but accommodate because you are coming to dinner. And then translate that into institution. So entering just insertion or just inserting piecing is not enough. It's a beyond duality, it's conversational between the two of us. Maybe another way of saying it is, so the Picasso that's in room 7, the green woman, came into that room, despite the relation, that theme, in thinking through a gentleman that we met in Drensdorp, this neighborhood, traditionally working class neighborhood in Eindhoven, so right before Streep, right after Streep S and right before Streep R. And a colleague had been arranged visits through different neighborhoods, visiting different art initiatives that are happening. And he expressed I'm not so interested in seeing sticks on the floor, sticks or stones on the floor, so he must have been referred to Richard Long or maybe Seurat. I want to see a Picasso if we have that in Eindhoven, and if this is I was thinking about this question too. So if I'm hosting and we're hanging out, he should be able to see the Picasso. So actually, that's one of the primary reasons it's there, so he can see it. Now we can go into Cubism and how this idea of like constructing human figure and how that relates to that room's theme, sure. But I think, if we're operating well, then we should also be doing that. Does that answer?
Yeah, fantastic.
Also, I think is there someone else who wants to ask? I think we are really close to our time. But I want to say, I think that again you come back to all those conditions that you took up in doing this work that you're doing. Also, maybe contingent encounter became also a condition for you how to move somewhere and host something or do something. And I feel that's very much a lesson for me in today's 5th Relational Matters Archive conversation. That relational matters are also really the awareness and also the daring to show the conditions or speak about the conditions that are informing that or that are required or that are always playing out or they are always there but often not paid attention to. And I think you made us aware very much of how much attention you pay to the different kinds of conditions of that work, of relating to all these different things. So with this, if you would not want to have the last word,
no.
Then I with this would really thank you, Yolande, for a wonderful moment of conversing about this question that we are trying to collect voices, all kinds of different multiple voices in this archive. It was a wonderful moment. Thank you very much. I also want to say thank you very much for you all being here.
Yes,
and
thank you so much.
for the Van Abbe Museum to host us. Having that
You're very welcome.
in this manner. We had a wonderful afternoon.
Contrived setting.
And from here on, I think we can conclude the video, of course, and can continue the conversations.
Thank you.